Hello! You seem excited, and that's true, because today we will guide you through the magic world of neuroscience. In order to do so, in today's episode, we have a special guest, Nick Sidorenko, who is a PhD candidate in neuroeconomics at the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. Nick, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and welcome aboard.
Thank you very much, Nikolaos, for having me today. It's an honor and pleasure to talk about my field, and let's dive in this world together.
Nick, before starting, I have a very simple but very important question to ask. What do we mean by neuroeconomics?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very important question because, as its name suggests, it may seem that it's just a combination between neuroscience and economics, but in reality, it's a bit deeper than that because our field is an interdisciplinary field where we are combining the knowledge from different domains like neuroscience and economics, of course, but also psychology, cognitive science, computer science, physics. So many multiple domains come into play to basically answer a simple question. How does the brain make decisions? And this is what the neuroeconomics is about. We are trying to understand what are the processes behind the decision-making process, and we are trying to upgrade our understanding of that by using the neural methods. And we are doing so by considering the economic theories. So we are trying to understand what are the processes, the neural and biological processes behind the economical theories that can also be driven by the psychological components as well.
Okay, I think now it's clear. So another thing I want to ask you is if there are any other fields which are close to neuroeconomics, like, for example, behavioral economics. And actually, can you also tell us how and when it all started?
Yeah, maybe we can start by the start, actually, by the origin of the field. So it all started back in the 90s, last century, when two very brilliant scientists, Michael Platt and Paul Blinker, they joined their efforts, as you said, to understand very basic question of how we are making decisions. So it all started in 1999 with a paper about the neural correlates of decision making. So they basically took a monkey and they tried to understand what was happening in the brain of that monkey, what were the regions that were involved in the representation of different decision-making components. Like there was a very simple task where the monkey could gain some reward with a certain probability. And what they did, they simply found what were the brain regions where the activity was associated with the reward and separately with the probability. And this was so revolutionizing because it was the first time, actually, when the scientists tried to combine the economic decision-making theory, where we talk about rewards, probabilities, and other decision-making components, with the neuroscientific methods of recording the brain activity. And the way they combined these two together, they saw that there is indeed a relationship between these two fields. So indeed, the variables, the components of the economic theory are represented in the brain. And that's how the whole field actually started, and the whole idea behind this wish to understand how the economic theories are implemented in the brain and how does the brain deals with the representation of decision-making components. And then it was 1999, and they started with another series of experiments, and different research hubs started originating, emerging all over the world, and basically other fields also started to originate from that, like neurolinguistics, neurofashion, neuropolitics, neurosociology. But in all those fields, the idea was the same. Take a theory, take a concept from an already existing field like economics, ethics, psychology, marketing, and try to understand how those concepts are represented in the brain. And what is the neural mechanisms, biological mechanisms behind those purely theoretical concepts. And if we talk now about behavioral economics, then you're completely right, Nicholas. This might be in some way a sibling of neuroeconomics, because indeed we are using the same methods to some extent, and we are also trying to answer the same questions. If we have a given economic theory, a given concept that describes how we are making decisions, then how it is all represented in our behavior. And behavioral economics would deal with that. They would try to find behavioral correlates and psychological mechanisms behind those concepts. And then neuroeconomics comes in and adds a supplementary layer, an extra layer of neural data to just enrich our understanding, upgrade our understanding of those economic concepts, of those theories, and prove that indeed it's not just a theory, it is something that is embedded in our brain and can be processed and represented by our brain.
Are there any scientific advancements in this field that led to practical changes in what we know about the human brain? How can society can be benefited from this knowledge?
Yes. So if we take the neuroeconomics from the beginning, then, as I said, it would be an upgrade of an existing economic theory. And I would say really a schoolbook example of that would be the prospect theory introduced by Kahneman and Tversky, and they also got the Nobel Prize for that in 2002. And so the theory is very simple. Basically, it describes how we are making our decisions when it comes to some risk. So if I give you an example of that theory, for example, if you have an exam, let's take a student example. You have an exam and you would have a choice, and you don't have much time for that exam, right? And you would have a choice between either not showing up to the exam and then fail for sure, or study as much as you can, show up to the exam, and maybe pass the exam if the questions that you didn't cover are not part of the exam, or fail if you are not lucky, and then those questions that you didn't revise for will be part of the exam. But in this case, it's a risky option, right? Because if you fail, then you also lose some time that you could have spent going to a party, for example. Whereas in the first case, you would just fail the exam, but would still have some time. And in this case, I guess most people would just go for the second option. So go for this exam and try to pass, because it's about a loss. And for most people, the obvious option here is to take a risk. Right? So in the loss domain, people would go with the risky option, because in the certain option, it's indeed something that they would lose definitely, and there is no other options involved. But if we now reverse the situation and we leave the loss domain and we go into the gain domain. So in this case, the example would be a TV show where the contestant would be given a chance to either get a certain sum of money, like, 10,000 bags, or go with a black box, which can be either empty or have the keys for a car, which is, of course, way more expensive than just 10,000 bucks. And in this case, if you look back at the statistics, most people would go for the certain option, and they would avoid the risky one. So in this case, the situation is reversed. The people who were risk-seeking in the loss domain and would have gone for the exam, now they become risk-aversive, and they would go for the safe option. And this is the core of the prospect theory, that people behave differently depending on the domain, gain or loss. But the thing is that this is just a theory. Of course, there are some behavioral components, some behavioral experiments showing that indeed we are acting in that way most of the time, but we still don't know what are the processes behind and whether indeed this is the theory that can be somehow found in the brain activity. And then in 2006, there was a study by DeMartino, and they simply took this task, a very simple economic task that could simulate the prospect theory conditions, and they found that indeed the human brain represents those components and acts differently depending on whether we are going according to the prospect theory or if we are going against the prospect theory, so we are more risk averse in the loss domain and more risk seeking in the gain domain. And what they found is that if we are going along the prospect theory, then one of the brain regions, amygdala, is getting more activated than we are going against the prospect theory. And this region has been associated with multiple things, but it's mostly known for its involvement in the emotional processing and has been extensively related to the fear processing. So the conclusion was that indeed maybe the fear is one of those driver mechanisms behind what we are doing in the prospect theory. And when people went against the prospect theory, they found that the region, the anterior singular cortex, was more activated than in the case of going alongside the prospect theory. And the interesting thing about that region is that it's involved in the conflict management. So the conclusion there was that indeed going against the theory involves a management of a conflict, a process of a conflicting options. And this was astonishing because first the authors found that there is a support for a theory because the components of the theory are represented in the brain. So it's not just an irrelevant task, no, it is encoded by the brain activity. But on top of that, they also suggested some mechanism behind it, that there might be fear processing involved and conflict management involved. And these are the main contributions, let's say the two classes of contributions of fields like neuroeconomics. They provide the support, the upgrade for the existing theories, but they also give hints about the mechanisms that might be behind those theories.
Nick, we have all watched some videos with experiments with monkeys and some astonishing findings, but can you please tell us about some mind-blowing scientific advancements or experiments in these fields that you're aware of?
Yeah, that's a very good question because, of course, whenever we are designing a study and trying to answer a purely scientific question, we always keep in mind what could be the applications to the real-life problems, because this is what drives the scientific discovery and scientific journey. We don't want to just discover some processes, we want them to be relevant for the problem solving in the everyday life. And that's a good question because indeed we have a couple of those examples in your economics field. So I'm thinking namely about a study by Hilke Plassmann from 2008. It's a very elegant study because it's about wine consumption. So what she did was a very simple setup. So she basically put people in the scanner to see their brain activity. And while they were in the scanner, she was giving them different types of wine. But she was also giving them the same types of wine. And the manipulation was that this same wine was presented at a different price. So basically, people were consuming the same wine while thinking that the price for this wine is different. For example, one wine would be at $10, whereas another one at $90. Right? So the only difference was just the price. Everything else, the taste, the flavor, the odor, was all the same. And what she found was mind-blowing. She found that not only people thought that the expensive wine was more pleasant and more tasty, although it was exactly the same wine as presented at $10, but also their brain was acting more heavily when they were tasting that wine. So she found that the brain activity was actually scaling with the price of the wine, although the wine was the same. And it was also scaling up with their subjective thinking about the pleasantness of the wine. So in other terms, not only people reported that they thought the expensive wine was better, their brain also thought in some way that the expensive wine tasted better. And this was a tremendous application because it showed that actually just the legend about the wine, the brand of the product may matter to change the activity in the brain. Not only and she showed it not only at the psychological level, at the behavioral level, but also at the brain level, by showing that maybe some very basic processes are involved into the processing of the brand. So now we can, of course, go into two sides. We can think like people in the marketing, how we could use that for us, but we can also think like the consumers, right? And be more careful when we think about the brands, and try to think more carefully when we are making a decision, and basically trying to have more clear preferences, more well-constructed preferences when it comes to a choice between maybe seemingly the same types of product.
I understand that this field is very important, for example, at the marketing and the business level, but how can you help society to unlock the mysteries of the brain or the mysteries of human decision making?
Yeah, there is now another branch of studies, and even a new field within the neuroeconomics itself, which can be classified as neuroforecasting. So in this way, we are trying to predict the consumer behavior by using not only the behavior itself, but also the neural data. So I can give a very simple example. There was a very elegant study in 2012, I think, by Burns and Moore. So what they did, they took a bunch of participants, a very representative sample, and they made them listen to different songs, very new songs, not even released on the market. And then they collected their behavioral ratings for those songs, or how much they liked those songs, but also the brain activity, how their brain was reacting when they were listening to those songs. And they looked at the very precise region called the ventral striatum, which is known to be related to the processing of reward and thing that we like. So they looked at that region, they took the activity from it, they measured the activity from that region, they collected the behavioral ratings, and then 3 years later, they looked at the performance of those songs on the market. So these songs were released, and the scientists simply tried to predict the success of those songs by using the metrics that they've collected 3 years ago. And they found that the behavioral ratings were not able to predict the success at all. But the neural signal was. And this was an astonishing result in two ways. The first one is that the neural signal basically outperformed the behavioral ratings in terms of prediction of the song success, which may be not really surprising because the behavioral ratings are known to be self-reported and not very reliable, because so many aspects can come in when we are trying to report something. And those ratings are subjective to biases. Of course, the brain activity is not pure either, so there might be some noise in the brain activity as well. This is also well known. But in this case, this brain activity was a better predictor, right? A less biased predictor of some performance. And the second way in which this result is astonishing is that it was a prediction of the aggregate choice. So they took a small sample of participants and they predicted the result in the whole market. So the performance that they predicted was not relevant to that bunch of participants. But the brain activity from this very small sample was strong enough to predict the performance of the songs, which is rated by a whole cohort of individuals, right? By the whole world, basically. And this is now a very promising field where we are trying to use the neural data, leverage on this neural data, to get a better understanding, a better prediction of different products. It may be the advertisement in health campaigns, maybe the YouTube videos, crowdfunding projects, so many things. And we constantly see that in those studies, the brain can outperform the pure behavior. And so if we are talking, for example, about the advertisements in health campaigns, it also makes me think about the healthy lifestyle changes that may be induced by the findings from neuroeconomics. So namely, there was a very elegant study by Park and the colleagues from 2017, I think, where they found a link between the brain activity, generosity, and happiness. So it was a very interesting study in so many ways. Basically, what the researchers did there was to ask people to make a commitment about either behaving selfishly for the upcoming 4 weeks. So, for example, buying gifts for themselves, go for dinners, treat themselves with concerts, plays in theater and stuff. And there was another group of people that were asked to behave generously, altruistically over the next 4 weeks. So they would go for a dinner and invite someone over. They would invite someone to a concert. They would buy a gift for their relatives and so on. So these 4 groups, they were behaving like that over 4 weeks. But prior to that, they had to make a commitment. So they came to the lab and said, yes, I would like to behave altruistically over the next 4 weeks, for example. And after making the commitment, but before acting like that over the 4 weeks, they also made another decision-making task where they had to make altruistic or selfish choices. And so what the researchers found was that people in the experimental group that committed to behaving altruistically, they started behaving altruistically already in the subsequent behavioral task, even without these 4 weeks. Just because they made the commitment, they started doing so. But in itself, it's not very surprising because they were already maybe in this mood of behaving altruistically. But what was surprising is that they reported that their feeling of happiness was higher, because the researchers asked them how happy they were before the commitment and after. And they found that the happiness ratings after they made this commitment to behave altruistically were higher than before. And on top of that, they also saw that the link between the region which is related to altruism and the region which is related to happiness was intensified. So people in this experimental group who simply made the commitment to behave altruistically were feeling happier, and their brain was reflecting this by this intensified link between the altruistic and happiness regions. And this was not found in the control group that committed to behave selfishly. And the beauty of this study is that the simple commitment, the simple fact that you put yourself in the mood of behaving altruistically and generously can induce changes in your brain such that you start feeling happier. And so this can be already taken as a consideration when we are thinking about our healthier lifestyle. What can we do to feel happier, to have a better well-being, and knowing that it's not just a subjective thing, but also something reflected in our brain.
I really want to ask you more about decision making, but while you were presenting these fascinating examples, there was a thought that sparked my curiosity. So, what are the main tools used in your research? I want to understand how your lab looks like. For example, do you use any MRIs, brain scanning, and is AI one of the tools that you use?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because neuroeconomics is all about tools. Of course, we are trying to test economic models and we are trying to explain what's behind the decision making, but we would be unable to do so if we didn't have those amazing tools that we have. And in our field, we are trying to resort to the whole bunch of neuroimaging tools. Basically, we are trying to understand the brain activity from different point of views. So you can imagine that we can look at the activity in the spatial resolution, but also in the temporal resolution. So if we are interested in the question, what is the brain region, or what is the circuitry of brain regions involved in a given process, then we would go with the MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging. We would try to see the brain activity in a given region that gets higher than in another condition, in a control condition, for example. And this tool is amazing because it's a real-time tool, so we can see in the real time what happens in the brain, but also we can pinpoint with more or less precision what is the brain region behind that. But what we also need to understand is how the process can unfold over time. And for this, the MRI is not a very good tool because It measures the activity, which is kind of slow, even though it's super useful for the spatial resolution and pinpointing of the brain regions. In itself, it's not very useful when it comes to the temporal resolution. And in this case, we would use the EEG. So encephalogram, we would try to understand how the brain waves, how the activity unfold over time among the different brain regions. This activity is the complete opposite of the MRI because we have a great temporal resolution, but a poor spatial resolution. So if we combine the two, we can of course enhance our power of understanding the decision-making processes. But what we also do, we try to stimulate the brain activity, because MRI and EEG are about measuring what's already happening in the brain. But we can also use the tools like TMS or TDCS in order to stimulate a given brain region and try to influence the behavior of our participants by inducing the electric or magnetic impulses in their brain. However, even if I'm talking always about the brain and we say neuroeconomics, it doesn't mean that the brain is the only point of interest for us. Because we are trying to get advantage of the whole processes, the whole physiological processes that we can consider. And I'm now thinking about the techniques like eye tracking, where we don't image the brain, but we are trying to capture the eye movements to understand different processes. So for example, if we talk about neuromarketing, we would use the eye tracking technique to understand where people put their eyesight when they are browsing a website. If they look at the right upper corner, or if they look straightforwardly on the item that they would like to buy, how much time they spent on that item. And this can also be very useful when it comes to uncover randomness in the choice, for example. Right? And there was a very elegant study that showed that the more you spend on the item, the more time you fixate the item, the more likely you are to buy that item, to go for it, to make a choice in favor of that. And this would be impossible if we wouldn't have this technique of eye tracking to record the eye activity. But the movement is not all. We can also look at the pupil dilation, which is a reflection of multiple physiological processes. We could see if the pupil dilates more, do we exert more control over our choices? Are we more aroused when we are making choices? And if yes, what's behind our arousal? What can be the outcome of our arousal? And this would be, again, very hard to measure if we didn't have that technique. But the arousal can be also measured by the skin conductance. So that's another tool that we can use. Just measure the skin conductance and understand how aroused we are. Or the heart rate variability. So we can simply measure the heart rate in different situations and understand how variable it is. And there have been multiple studies showing that the better is the heart rate variability, the more variable is the heart rate, the more we are able to adapt in different situations and cope with the stress, which can also be beneficial for the decision-making process in ambiguous situations. So there are multiple tools that come into play when we are talking about neuroeconomics. Not only neural tools, although of course it is the majority of what we are doing, the major part of our techniques. And you also mentioned the AI, which is of course super relevant to the nowadays situation in academia and also in other fields. And I'm namely thinking about two ways of applying the AI. One would be the data analysis, right? Because we know how powerful the AI to understand the hidden patterns behind different processes. And this is what we can use in order to understand those processes, those patterns behind the different situations that we can simulate in the lab. Of course, the downside of that would be that we would need right now a very huge sample size and enough data points, which may be pretty challenging for most of the labs and most of the studies, because we are dealing with sample sizes like 60 to 100 participants, and for a decent AI algorithm, we would need way more data points. But this, I guess, in at least 5 years, would be already something that we would use on a daily basis. And then the second way of applying the AI in neuroeconomics would be the simulation of the environments, right? Because so far we are using either the individual tasks, so where the participant doesn't interact with anyone but makes the choices on their own, or we use some social tasks where participants interact with each other. But given that our daily interaction with AI becomes more and more frequent and omnipresent, there are some emerging studies that try to combine the interaction with AI with the neuroeconomic tools. And they set up the experiments where people would be interacting with the AI and try to maybe get their choices either influenced or helped by this interaction.
Now that we understand a bit more about this field, can you also can you please describe to us the main decision-making steps?
Yeah, that's a very great question, because neuroeconomics is mostly about decision-making processes. So we are trying to summarize and understand those decision-making steps. And there has been a very influential model proposed by Rangel, Kamher, and Montag in 2008. And they talked about 5 stages of the decision-making process. So if we take a very simple example of, let's say, making a choice between Apple and Samsung, right? So we are in a store, or even we are somewhere in a mall, and there are 2 stores, right? The Apple store and Samsung store. And we are trying to think where we would like to buy a new smartphone or a new tablet, whatever. And so the first step would be to represent those options. So to first understand that indeed in my environment, I have on one side Apple and on the other side the Samsung store. And this representation step is already something that plays a very major part on the decision-making process, because we need something here that would catch our attention, that would be super salient to be able to catch our attention in a fraction of a second and entice us to move towards the direction of that option. And here I'm thinking namely about the visual areas involved, because this is what process the stimuli in this way, the Apple and Samsung at the first stage. So the representation is super relevant, and for example, the shorter would be the name of the store, the better it is to catch our attention, because our memory span is also limited to some extent. So it's better if we don't overwhelm it. That's why maybe some marks like Apple and Samsung opt for these short and catchy words, right? Then the next step, once we understood what is there in our environment and we filtered all the irrelevant options, we would go for valuation. So that would be the second step. We would try to evaluate what the options are. And in this case, we would go, for example, for remembering what was our previous experience. Maybe we are already an Apple fan. So in this case, our subjective value that we would assign to the Apple Store would be higher, because we are already having a relationship with this brand. Or maybe indeed our experience was not that positive and we would like to change. So the values in this case would be more of a tabula rasa, right? They would be more inexistent, and we would go for something new. And the novelty would be the main driver here. And the evaluation is also subjective to the biases, just as I described. We can be biased by the novelty, we can be biased by sticking to the previous option. So if we are already a fan of a given brand, we would go for the brand again, just because of the perseveration bias. But we can also be pressured by our peers. So if everyone in our environment is using the same brand, we may be prompt to use the same brand as well. So the evaluation is a crucial step because it helps us to understand what our preferences are, but it is subjective to multiple biases. And there are multiple studies as well that try to identify what could be the region in the brain associated with the assignment of the subjective value. And so far, they all converge on the fact that indeed there is an area in the prefrontal cortex called the BMPFC that could be related to the assignment of this value. But also the ventral striatum, again, that we've talked about before, this reward-related region, has been involved in the assignment of the value as well. Then, the third step would be the selection. So, we now know what are different options in our environment. We know how much we like them, what is their value for us, and we have to make the choice. So in our case, it would be very simple. We would just direct ourselves towards a given store. We would simply walk and enter, let's say, the Apple store. In this case, our motor areas that are responsible for making us walking and visual areas as well could be responsible for making this action selection and perform an action of entering the shop and maybe taking the item in our hands. But this step is subjective to the randomness of the choice, because even though our representation of the value can be very clear and we definitely know we would like to enter this given shop, maybe there is something happening around this shop. I don't know, there is a dog barking, for example, or someone has a small accident, and we will think, oh, maybe I will not go there right now. Maybe I will first try to check the Samsung store. And this simple event can inject some randomness in our choice, and even though our preference for the Apple store was super clear at the beginning, we make the selection of another store just because of the simple randomness. So we should not forget about that, and this is a huge topic in neuroeconomics, the randomness of the choice. Even though our understanding of our preferences may be crystal clear, it doesn't mean that we would always behave as such simply because the randomness is omnipresent and that we can always make a random choice. Although some people would argue that random choices are not random and there are some underlying hidden patterns behind that make them so not random. So, we entered the store, we bought the item. The choice is made, but the decision-making process is not over. The fourth step is the evaluation of the outcome. Because now we have to understand, was our choice good? And update the representation of our values. Because as you remember, in the valuation process, what was happening, we were trying to retrieve the subjective value that was already stored in us from our previous experiment. And now we are trying to update this value. We are trying to understand, do we like it or not? Is it really what we were hoping for or not? And once we evaluated the outcome, we can go to the final step, which is learning. So this is the step that goes into the storing of our experience, the new experiments, and it updates the value itself so that when we are confronted with the choice the next time, we can use the new value. In this case, again, the ventral striatum would be involved because this region is not involved merely in the reward processing, but also in learning and in the update of our predictions. And in this case, we can also be subject to the peer pressure, and this is very interesting, because even though we may be very clear about what was our experience with the item during the evaluation process, the fourth step, then we can talk to our friends, for example, or we can go to social media and try to get the experience from other people, and we can downgrade or upgrade our own experience. So the learning process is not only the simple storage of our own experience into our memory, it's really an update, and this update can be influenced by multiple things and multiple biases. So it's not that naive and simple as it may seem at the first glance. But all in all, these would be the 5 major steps of any decision-making process, although of course the decisions may vary between them We don't always make a very clear action. We don't always grasp something physically like an item. We can always make decisions without performing a clear action, but most of the decisions can be decomposed in those 5 stages.
Okay, we are much wiser than before. We know there is a 5-step decision-making model, which, I don't know, it might change in the future, it might be enhanced a bit or not, but what are the main factors? I mean, I think the next step is to understand what are the main factors that influence our decisions. I'm asking because when it comes to making decisions in our lives, do you think we are making smart, rational choices?
This is an interesting thing because you combine the words rational and smart, but in neuroeconomics, we believe that those things are not actually correlated. An irrational choice may be as smart as a rational one, given the factors that are influencing our environment. So that's why your question is super relevant. What are the factors that can influence a decision? Of course, a given scientific economic model can stipulate that there is a rational way of acting. But it's not always the good way, given our own experience. Because going for a risky option when it seems rational to go for a safe option may be just defined by our risk preference. And if we are risk aversive, it's not necessarily something bad, it's not necessarily something good, it's just our own preference. And in this case, this rationality would be just a theoretical assumption, but our own experience would give us more pleasantness and subjective pleasure if we would go for a so-called irrational option. So in this case, I would talking more about rational and deliberative actions. Because rational is something that is rational, so this is how it should be in the ideal world where there is no other factors influencing our decision. And deliberative is something that would go into the world where there are those factors acting on our decisions, but the outcome of the decision would be beneficial for us. And among those experiments, I would think about the emotions. Because if we talk about the deliberation, then the opposite of that would be an emotional answer. So we don't talk about rationality, we talk more about deliberation and emotional answer. And emotions are a huge component that can influence the decision making. Because of course we all know that if we are stressed, if we are happy, if we are angry, our consideration of the same situation may differ hugely, right? So if we are stressed, we may make more hasty generalizations, for example, and we could not act as we would act as if we were not stressed. And here I'm thinking about one interesting experience where people were asked a very simple question. So they were presented with different faces, male faces and female faces, and they were asked, would you like to classify those faces according to the gender? So do you think this is a male face or a female face? A very simple manipulation. But what they didn't know is that some of them were assigned to a group where they saw predominantly happy faces. Some of them were in the group with predominantly neutral faces, and some with predominantly sad faces. And this was actually the hidden manipulation in that study. So basically, the happy group was primed to the happy emotion because most of the faces they saw were happy, whereas the third group was mostly primed to the sadness. And this was a mood induction, so they were induced in this respective mood of happiness or sadness, or nothing at all if they were in a neutral group. And after this classification task, they were asked to consume some beverage, say how much they like it, and say how much they would like to pay for a subsequent glass of that beverage. And what the researchers found was simply astonishing. They found that actually being in the happy mood increased how much people liked the beverage, but also how much they wanted to pay for having an additional glass of it when compared to the neutral group. And it was a complete opposite in the sadness group. So people there didn't like the beverage as much as the neutral group, and they also wanted to pay less for it. And this one of the seminal studies showing the involvement of the emotions in the decision-making process. Although at the beginning, we would think that they would all like to pay the same amount of money for the same beverage, right? But it seems not to be the case. And I have to reassure you at that point, because I think nowadays those studies would be unlikely because of the ethical considerations. We would not split people into the groups with hidden agenda. So nowadays, at least in our research center, those studies would be prohibited, because we also try to construct a link based on trust and faithfulness with our participants. Otherwise, all that we are doing would not have any sense. But even though we know that the emotions can influence our decision making, we are not that hopeless in front of them, because there are multiple techniques that help us to regulate our emotions. We can suppress our emotions at all. We can try to tell ourselves a story to reframe our understanding of the situation and try to change our perception of it. For example, we would change the perception of a bad situation by looking at the positive aspects of it to make ourselves think better about this. And what we saw in neuroeconomics is that by doing so, by applying those regulation techniques to our emotional states, we can actually modulate our own choices. We can become less loss aversive. We can have less disposition effect when it comes to the investment, for example. And the cherry on top, as we're talking about neuroeconomics, most of those changes were also reflected in the changes in the brain activity.
I promise that one day we will invite you again to talk in more detail about emotions and this mechanism. But Nick, your job sounds fascinating, and if some people from the audience are interested in exploring this scientific field, can you tell us how can someone become a neuroeconomist? Is there a path that most people follow?
So the simple answer would be no. There is no common path, and that's the beauty of our field. So the thing is that neuroeconomics is an interdisciplinary field. And we can have researchers with backgrounds from physics, mathematics, neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science, computer science. Basically, anyone can become a neuroeconomist, because this is a very young field, it's an emerging field, and we're trying to take the best from all the worlds. So we are combining multiple research techniques, we are combining multiple tools, as we've just discussed, right? And upgrading those tools, understanding those tools is an important part of neuroeconomics. So anyone with an engineering background would be welcome. If you are an MRI physicist, you will be able to understand how to better capture the brain activity, and you can be a neuroeconomist because your knowledge in the MRI technique would be just priceless. The same counts for the computer scientists who are developing models, because then neuroeconomists would use those models to simulate the behavior of their participants. This is on the methodological side. What we can also do is to look at the process side. So we are trying to understand what are the processes behind the decision that we are making. And the processes can be biological, they can be psychological, they can be physiological, neural processes. And people, the scientists who are dealing with those processes, like psychologists, economists, philosophers, biologists, neurologists, neuroscientists, they're all welcome because they have this knowledge about what is happening during all those processes. And then they can integrate this knowledge into understanding of the decision-making under the economic assumptions. And then the third aspect would be the design of the study, because neuroeconomics is an empirical field. So we are trying to set up an experiment to test a hypothesis. And the setup of the experiment is the good one if we are first controlling for different variables, but second, if we are approximating the real life. Because of course, if our experiment is controlling for everything in the world, but is not relevant for our daily life, it will be difficult to translate our findings from this to the real world. So we are trying to approximate our daily life situations as much as we can in our experimental designs. And in this case, people with a social science background, like the international relationships, law, food science, environmental sciences, fashion, they're all welcome because they know how to construct those valid ecological paradigms to test behavior. So now, for example, I'm thinking about people who are studying the interpersonal relationships between two countries. So, for example, how people from one part of the world would behave altruistically or selfishly towards people from another part of the world. And in this case, we would truly benefit from the knowledge of someone who was studying those parts of the world and their historical interpersonal relationships, right? And all this just to say that in neuroeconomics, no matter what is your background, you can always find how to apply this background to construct a valid study and make a breakthrough. And all the rest that you would need to know, you can learn on the fly, because again, it's an emerging science and it's a young science, and we don't really have much to learn in some way, right? We don't have 60 years of studies to read. No, it can be all very quick and easy to grasp because we're also trying to make it as intuitive as possible. So the message would be, no matter what your background is, you can always thrive in neuroeconomics, and everyone would be welcome.
Since our journey today started from Switzerland, we would like to hear more about the Neuroscience Center of Zurich. Can you please tell us a bit more about the center and the areas that your team covers?
Yeah, exactly. So our center is located in Zurich and the University of Zurich, but we are also collaborating with the ETH in Zurich and with the University Hospital of Zurich because our lab is located there. And so our center is a combination of different groups. It's a constellation of different research groups. So basically, it's a hub of neuroeconomics in some way. And we are trying to lead our research in this collaborative manner. So we are covering the neuroeconomics from different points of view because we have the chairs that are dealing with the theory, decision and neuroeconomics theory. So these people would, of course, run the experiments, but their task is to develop theoretical concepts behind the decision-making processes. We would also have researchers who are dealing with experimental economic research, the microeconomics, because this is what would give the basis for the development of those theories. But we also work with the decision neuroscience per se, so we are trying to set up the experiments that would then test those economic assumptions. And we are doing so in different concepts. We are doing so in the concept of social choice, for example. We are also doing it with the concepts of individual choice. When it comes to money, when it comes to the food items, fashion items, whatever we can purchase, we can buy, whatever we can choose, it all goes into our neuroeconomic experiments. But we also consider the different factors that may influence those decisions. So now I'm mainly thinking about the experiments that we run about the human development. So how the choices are different at different stages of life, during the adolescence, during the aging. How can our choices change in the healthy aging, for example? And the emotions again. So we have a bunch of studies done in our lab and still ongoing studies where we are considering the emotion impact on the decision making. And last but not least, as I mentioned already, the tools are paramount for the neuroeconomic research. So we have a group of MRI physicists who are always constantly trying to improve, upgrade our research tools as much as they can to provide the state-of-the-art techniques for measuring the brain processes.
It's an honor for us to have our first guest from Switzerland, and we know that this country is a global powerhouse regarding innovation and entrepreneurship. So it's very tempting to ask, from your experience, what are the main factors that make this ecosystem perform so well?
So we've just talked about the diversity of backgrounds that can thrive in neuroeconomics, and I would say one of the main reasons why Switzerland is so successful in entrepreneurship would be the diversity of this country, right? Because we have multiple cultures cohabiting together. We have 4 linguistic and cultural regions, and we have been unifying those differences over centuries. And this is also reflected in our daily work, in our approach to any project that we are starting. And as we all know, the diversity is one of the keys to the success. So I would say in our case, it also works and could be one of the drivers for our success in the entrepreneurial domain. But it could also be the fact that we have so many world-class research hubs like the ETH Zurich or ETH Lausanne. Those polytechnical schools are constantly ranked very high in the world-class ranking of the universities. And we are indeed trying to make the impactful research, the state-of-the-art research, as much as we can. But we also don't forget that the research per se is relevant only if it can be applied afterwards to solving the real-life problems, because generating the knowledge per se doesn't matter that much unless we can really apply it to something. And we are trying to make a very tight collaboration between our academic institutes and the industrial world. So I'm thinking, for example, about the city of Basel, where we have so many pharmaceutical companies, and the university hospital and the University of Basel. We can think about the University of Zurich, ETH Zurich, or University of Lausanne, and the ETH Lausanne, which are located in the cities which also have a lot of startups in the same cities. So the simple fact that the universities and the startups are in the same cities, this special closeness between them is, of course, an accelerator for generating thriving projects and successful entrepreneurial relationships. And I'm also thinking about sustainability, not only in the environmental way, but simply the fact that we are trying to think over long term about what we are doing, what we are implementing, and we are designing our projects with this aim, not only to deliver something right now, but also to deliver something on a long term, so that it matters also 10 years later.
Because of your PhD, you connect with a lot of students. Perhaps many young people would like to follow your path. What is your piece of advice to the next generation of scientists of your field or related fields?
I would like to summarize it in one single word, which will be explore. Just don't be afraid of anything new. Explore, go for it. If you think it's worth a try, just go for it. Because if you don't try it, if you don't dive into this new exciting opportunity, you will never know if it is what you want, if it is what fits you. And I remember myself when I was about to decide where to do my PhD, I just knew that I was interested in decision making. I wanted to apply neuroimaging techniques because this was my background, and I wanted to do something that could be applied to the daily life problems straightforwardly. And then when I was simply trying to find those keywords on the web, I found out that there was this exciting field of neuroeconomics. It was actually grouping, taking together all those things I was interested in. That I've never heard about this before. So on one side, I had a field that seems to be what I'm looking for, and on the other side, I have 4 years commitment of a PhD into something that I've discovered a couple of hours ago. And luckily for me, really fortunately for me, I decided to go and explore and dive into this new world. Even though it was completely new to me, I decided to make this step, and I've never regretted this decision. It was a huge experiment, and it is still a huge experience for myself, and I keep enjoying it every day. So I hope it will be the same for people who are watching us. And I would like just to say, don't be afraid of exploring new things.
I hope you all enjoyed our today's episode about the neuroeconomics and neuroscience in general. You can find below more details about Nick, and you can easily reach out to him in case you have any questions. So Nick, thanks again, and thanks everyone for watching. See you next time.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. See you.